Hi, my name is Autif Kamal, and this is my fourth episode of Be Logical. This one is on conditional propositions, which are also known as hypothetical propositions. In a conditional proposition, you have a cause that is proposed, and then after that you have an effect that is also proposed to immediately result from it. So the common format that you'll see it in is if whichever particular cause, then a particular effect will occur. So to give you a more specific example, if a car crashes, then there will be a scratch on that car. That's an example of a common format of a conditional proposition. And I think a great advantage to a conditional proposition is that it makes the link between a cause and effect very simple and clear by putting them right next to each other. So a question you should ask yourself is, okay, when should you use a conditional proposition? A good example of when you should use a conditional proposition is when a link between the cause and the effect is not clear. That is, when you're reading an article or when you're hearing a conversation, there could be causes and effects which are related to each other but are not directly linked in that article or in that conversation. And if you are able to identify those causes and those effects and then reformulate them so that you put them into a conditional proposition, you'll make their link clearer to yourself. Okay. Now, to illustrate that, I'm going to go over an article with you. Okay. The name of the article is 106 Years After the Jungle, Squalid Factories, and Foodborne Diseases Are Rising Again. This is in the Daily Ticker on Yahoo, and it's by Nicole Goodkind. Okay. So I'm going to give you examples from here of how to link basically causes and effects that are distant in the article and make their relationship to each other more obvious through the use of conditional propositions. I'm going to start referring to Nicole Goodkind's article. Now, for those of you who have access to the video of this podcast, I will be very specific about which parts of the article I'm referring to, and I'll be kind of jumping around, but I want to show you how you could take parts of this article which are not right next to each other, and you can link them to show cause and effect using conditional propositions. For those of you who do not have access to this video, I'm going to try to be extremely specific in how I'm speaking, so that if you decide to be proactive, if you have the time to be proactive, then you can go right to this article that I'm referring to, so you get an idea of how I'm linking causes and effects even though they're not right next to each other. Okay. Now, if you go to the 7th line down, Nicole Goodkind asks this question. She asks, why is food in the United States so riddled with disease that it's killing citizens? Now, assuming that that question is not purely rhetorical, then it would be natural to assume that whatever information comes after this question will help us come to an answer. Okay. Now, if you go to the 9th line down, it says that Stephanie Amore, a food safety and public health reporter at Bloomberg, investigated that question. So that is what Nicole Goodkind's findings are based on. Now, if you go to the 13th line down, it says that the Food and Drug Administration has an annual budget of $1 billion. And it's competing with an annual food sales in the United States of 1.2 trillion. Now, if you go to the 15th line down, it says, because of these budget constraints, the annual budget of $1 billion versus the annual food sales of 1.2 trillion, the FDA is just able to inspect 6% of domestic food producers and 0.4% of importers. So just right there, you can make a conditional proposition. So the conditional proposition I would make is that if the FDA had an annual budget of greater than $1 billion, then they would be able to inspect more than just 6% of domestic food producers. Or another way you could phrase it is, if the FDA had a sufficient budget, then they would definitely be able to inspect more than just 6% of domestic food producers. Okay, so those are two examples. Now, as you read this article, you get the idea that if Nicole Goodkind was to pick whether it's better to have third-party auditors or the FDA inspect food, that she would pick the FDA. And I'll give you some specific examples of that. Now, she says, unfortunately, these third-party auditors are far from ideal inspectors. Okay, that gives us the idea that she would prefer the FDA. Then she also says, people have died after these food safety inspection firms have gone in and said everything's great. Again, that gives us the idea that she thinks that it's better to have the FDA inspect food. And then she says plants that receive superior scores, as in from the third-party auditors, are often later found by the FDA to be packed with mold, cockroaches, rats, and pigeons. So the FDA is making these findings of whether factories are actually producing food in a healthy way. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out, and the reason why I'm pointing all of that out is because at the very beginning of this article it says foodborne illnesses kill 3,000 Americans each year. Nearly 130,000 more are hospitalized. The aggregate cost of foodborne illnesses to the United States economy in 2011 was $77.7 billion. Okay, now I'm going to return back to that 13th line about the FDA administration's annual budget. Now, it would be a great question to ask if, in the following way, using hypothetical propositions. If the FDA had an annual budget of greater than $1 billion, then would there be less than 3,000 Americans killed each year? Okay, and again we can ask, if the FDA had an annual budget of greater than $1 billion, then would there be less than 130,000 people that were hospitalized? And last time, you can ask again, if the FDA had an annual budget of greater than $1 billion, then would there be an aggregate cost of foodborne illnesses to the U.S. economy that would be less than $77.7 billion? And the only reason why I phrase the the conditional propositions that way is because it sounds like she's less inclined to think that the third-party auditors would improve those statistics, and probably more inclined to think that the FDA would improve those statistics of Americans killed each year, number of people hospitalized, and cost to the U.S. economy. Okay, so those are examples of how you can take parts from an article that are very distant from each other. In this case, the last three examples that I gave you, they were literally like 13 lines apart. They weren't right next to each other. Those are examples of how you can link distant causes and effects to each other. And I just want to point out why, I just want to elaborate again on why it's important to know how to bring together causes and effects that are distant. Like, it just simply makes it easier to
make that linkage. And I can give you an analogy for that. Let's say you live in a house, you're coming out of your house, you're walking on the driveway, and as soon as you get onto the driveway from your door of your house, you see this guy smash your windshield, and then he runs off. In that case, you see the cause and the effect immediately, and that guy just runs off. Now imagine a second scenario. Again, you're walking out of your house and then onto your driveway. As you look to your right, you see your car and you see that the windshield is smashed. Then you look back to the bottom of the driveway and you see this guy running off. In that case, it'll take you longer to link the damage to your car to the cause, the person who's running off. Okay, now let me give you one last scenario. Again, you're walking out of the door of your house, you walk onto your driveway, you look to your right, you see that your windshield is smashed, you look to your left, you look to the bottom of the driveway, you don't see anybody there, you don't see anybody in your neighborhood, all you see is that smashed windshield. You probably have an idea that, like, okay, someone must have smashed my windshield, but because the cause has run off, so to speak, it'll be much more difficult to make that linkage, since that cause is much more distant in terms of it just not being present. It's gone now. Okay, and that's the analogy I want to use to show you why it's important to, whether in speech or in an article, to make causes and effects consecutive to each other, so it's easier to make that linkage. Okay, and thank you for watching and or listening to this podcast.